Cosatu is calling for Cape Town's Safety and Security MMC, JP Smith, to be suspended over the taxi strike in the province. The Trade Union Federation says the impounding of taxis, which led to this mass strike, directly impacts those most vulnerable. It's accusing Smith of making decisions emotionally and not considering the working class, as well as the poor who are now left stranded. The strike by Santaco is continuing this morning after talks collapsed last night. Let's unpack this a bit further with Cosatu's Parliamentary Officer, Tony Ehrenreich, who joins us via our video link this morning. And Tony, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time. Why should JP Smith take the fall for this?
Well, good morning and thank you very much. We think this is an important issue that has a national effect because South Africa, Cape Town also fits into our national supply chains. So to bring the situation to such a crisis where the main roads into Cape Town are shut down, workers can't get to work, the economy is going to suffer, and already the economic crisis that affected many poorer communities who are in the main affected by the problems related to public transport has not been dealt with adequately. What we've seen is that the bylaw has now been turned into a crisis around public transport for poorer people. This should surely have been dealt with much better from the authorities, and we feel that JP Smith is the main one that's weaponizing taxi regulations and effectively is fueling a war on the Cape Flats, because the problems around public transport is now grinding the city to a halt, and JP Smith, who should not even be in the lead of any discussions dealing with public transport, is now exacerbating the situation by calling for the arrest and impoundment of taxis if there are any further incidents. Now, we also condemn incidents of violence, and that must stop immediately, but you can't have a tit-for-tat situation where everybody's going to end up blind. We need mature heads at the negotiating table to find a solution so that public transport can get back on board. And the bylaw issues about number plates and other stuff, JP Smith will use the courts to execute that. You can't elicit a fight with an important industry when you haven't given negotiations a chance with a senior enough political leadership. And that's why I'm asking for the Premier's inclusion.
I hear that, but I can imagine a situation where people are asking questions around whether JP Smith makes unilateral decisions during these negotiations. Where's everybody else from the city, at least, to provide balance at the very least, if JP Smith is the emotional player, for lack of a better term here?
Well, we think that there is a problem. This is clearly the political agenda, because in the rest of the country we can find solutions to challenges that arise from time to time in the taxi industry, as they inevitably will. But we must find solutions around the negotiating table, and we think if you can't find solutions in a locale, in a metropolitan or in a municipality, then the province and national government must be involved. Where we think JP Smith's kind of style inflames the situation and doesn't help us to get towards solutions, as when he calls for a tit for that kind of attitude in his Twitter accounts by saying that they must now arrest more taxis in the event of there being any incidents of violence on the Cape Flats, which may be totally unrelated to the industry. So all he's doing is causing further challenges and not helping us to get closer to a solution on the crisis. While they're bickering over a bylaw on number plates, poor workers are now unable to get to work, the economy is suffering, and just a general state of paralysis in the Western Cape exists, and all because of the rash decisions and statements by one of the senior politicians, namely JP Smith.
Yeah, I think most people will agree that the impact of the strike is completely regrettable, but those sympathetic to the city are worried that if there is a major concession on their part, it sets a dangerous precedent around how taxi operators, if they're in deep disagreement with the law in this case, are able to just simply park their vehicles until the city caves in.
Well, we agree. We should not be giving into extortion from any quarters in any negotiations. The purpose is to focus on the objectives. But what's happening now? There must be a lesser consideration and a more important consideration in respect of the social impact. If a taxi doesn't want to properly manage his number plates or wheel spins in the streets, arrest them or give them citations and force them to appear in court to answer for that. But you can't shut down a whole industry where the workers and the economy has already gone through difficult times in South Africa because of a range of other social challenges, not least of which the legacy of apartheid, COVID, the international crisis around inflation. All of those things must be taken into account. And now to create, because when you put people between a rock and a hard place, of course, the taxi industry has no other option but to resort to strike action. but the workers and the economy needs must be greater than the needs for JP and the city administration to deal with one or two people, like I say, who are wheel spinning or have number plates that don't comply. Those matters can be dealt with differently. We call for cool heads, and we certainly call for some mediation process, because those at the table at the moment is now into the second week of the protest action, a second week of the inability to find a solution, and the second week of hardships for people who depend on the economy and public transport in the city of Cape Town.
Yeah, and given how the situation is looking like this morning, it is unthinkable that it will be sustained for another 24 hours, let alone till Wednesday. But this does also give us an opportunity, I suppose, to speak about the conditions that some of the taxis are actually in Cape Town. You speak about one or two incidents where people can be taken to court, but is it that, Tony? Is it just one or two drivers?
But again, I want to say the scope and the extent of the challenges and what the particular areas of the challenges are, that's why we have the professionals sitting around the table finding solutions. But what we thought with the professionals are not helping. JP Smith, and this has not been the first rash statement from his side, he inflames negotiations. It seems that there may even be an agenda to provoke these kind of actions, because like you say, people have this attitude that in the entire country, taxis are a means to themselves and an authority to themselves. So that's a matter that must be dealt with bylaw regulations and court decisions if need be. You can't take it to the point where you're now squabbling over license plates and other bylaw issues, and you turn that into a national crisis and certainly a provincial-wide crisis. So yes, indeed, we must have law and order. We're losing too many lives on the streets, and that must be more effectively managed by a proper regulatory environment for taxis where they know the rules of the game and they have to comply with the game. But we don't want to get this crisis lost in that challenges that exist. That must be resolved as part of the ongoing work that we do to provide better service delivery to our people. But when you provoke a situation where the only possible consequence is a strike, with the horrendous impact on communities who, because of apartheid, are placed far away from their workplaces, then you're going to have the crisis that you see. We're just saying there should have been cooler heads at the tables, more wiser decisions should have been taken, and certainly at the very least, remove those from the negotiations or even suspend JP Swift. Because we think in terms of the obligations for good governance, the questions around what we must do as a society, that JP hasn't discharged himself as a responsible, sober civil servant. And what we should do is make sure that those impediments to a resolution is removed from the discussions, and we put in place an opportunity for responsible people to help us to find a solution to the strike firstly, and then to the second, but secondly in importance, the question about how do we enforce bylaws in the city of Cape Town.
Yeah. Look, if we're going to find a solution, you're absolutely right. Cool heads need to be around the table. What's your response, though, to claims made by the city? In fact, I think it was the MEC for Mobility, Ricardo McKenzie, who spoke to us and said they were very surprised when taxi operators decided to call on the strike because, quite frankly, before the introduction of these bylaws, there was consultation, and these taxi operators, at least some of their representatives, were part of those talks.
We're now living in the space where everybody's going to put out propaganda to appeal for public support, to make sure that they're not seen as the ones held responsible for where we find ourselves today. And so they can't have those negotiations in the media or in this form on TV. They must, both the parties must be sufficiently responsible to, in those engagements, focus on the key issue. And the first key issue is to provide public transport for our people. The secondary issue is to manage the questions about bylaws. So whether people were included or not, we see people out on the street. We've seen the rash statement from JP and others, and we shouldn't be trying to now shift the blame. What we should be focusing is on finding a solution to the public transport crisis. Because if we leave JP in those discussions, he's going to turn a bylaw, an issue related to bylaws and related to number plates. He'll turn that into a low-scale civil war, as we see on the streets of the Cape Flats, with buses burning and all the other mayhem that's stopping people from being able to earn their livelihoods. Now, that's the reason why Cosatu is concerned about it, and that's why Cosatu is calling for the removal of those who are not helping and the introduction or the inclusion of responsible persons to help us find a solution. We must suspend those who provoke this action, because the cost to the economy of the Western Cape, the cost to people's lives are horrendous. And we've let somebody like J.P. Smith, in a relatively minor position, put the city of Cape Town in that circumstance. We've got to find different solutions, and for that you need different, more sober players to be driving the process.
Tony Ehrenreich, thanks very much indeed for your weighing in on our discussion around this issue. Really do appreciate it. Tony is Cosatu's parliamentary officer. And of course, for the record, J.P. Smith certainly has an opportunity to reply to those allegations, given what's been said around at least his culpability in getting the strike to where it is. It's a big story that we're certainly going to keep watching for you as it unfolds.